Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk about creating the kinds of always changing, wonderfully messy cities and towns that we humans clearly love. We'll talk with those people trying to revive them or create them anew, whether they be designers, developers, builders, planners, or just anyone interested in the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I mentioned a few episodes back that we had this wonderful small-scale developer forum here in Kansas City that Jim Hyde hosts a couple months back. And on the opening night of the session, I felt probably as inspired as I've been in a long, long time to just see these like 1-minute presentations of all the attendees and what they were doing. If I would definitely recommend, if you're in this world and you want to get inspired by other entrepreneurs, it's an incredible event to attend. We're fortunate today to have a couple of guests with us from the Pacific Northwest who attended that, and we're going to talk about the work that they're doing in Bend, Oregon. I've got Jesse Russell and Ryan Andrews from Hiatus Homes in Bend. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, Kevin, nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for
I
doing
appreciate
this.
it. Thanks for having us.
Well, looking forward to this. I saw a little bit of your work just very, very briefly at the session, and did a little digging and looking at your website. There's a lot of really cool stuff that you're doing. First, before we get into things, why don't you tell us a little bit about Bend, Oregon, like what kind of a place it is and what's going on there in your world?
Yeah, sure. So Bend is in Central Oregon, right in the center of the state. We're pushed up right against the Cascade Mountains, so we have kind of a unique climate here where we're on the east side of the mountains. So half of our city is kind of in the forest, and half is in the high desert. So we get a lot of sunshine over here, and we have a lot of outdoor activities, a lot of mountain biking, a lot of snowboarding and skiing. I think we were called Beer USA at one point because we have over 20 microbreweries, which are called craft breweries now.
Yeah.
But really cool place to grow up. I grew up here, and just a really beautiful community. And even people who move into town that didn't grow up here, like Ryan, usually move here for what the locals love too, which is all the outdoor activities and having a great community.
Yeah, I would say, as somebody living in the middle of the country, when I look at the website and everything else, it gives off those like really interesting, like Pacific Northwest vibes that to a flat earther here, it seems it seems just very exotic and interesting. So, and I love all the images. I want to talk a little bit about how you got into this world of doing small scale development. I know you both have very different backgrounds originally. And Jesse, I know you worked in TV for a while, so I think we have to talk about that. Because one of the things I really like to do is share the stories of people who become entrepreneurs in this world. And it's fascinating how people come from such totally different backgrounds all the time. But why don't you talk a little bit about how you got interested in design and development?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Bend, and as I was saying, Bend was a wonderful place to grow up in. And as I traveled around the U.S. and the world and had different jobs and lived in different places, I really started to recognize how special Bend really was as a place to live. So I graduated with a degree in journalism at the University of Oregon, and then eventually had a career in reality television, which landed me in Los Angeles. And I was living down in L.A. For almost 10 years and was just really getting pretty fed up with what that job was. I really enjoyed the process of, I was a producer, so I would work with the crews and work with the editors, and we would have a budget, and we would eventually deliver an episode of television. I loved the process of it, but I really hated kind of what our product was at the end of the day. And so I started kind of going through a bit of a, what am I doing with my life stage? Started meditating, going to yoga camps, reading lots of self-help books, and just like kind of like, what am I going to do? Knew I wanted to go back to Bend, but there was very little production work here. So part of my job was pitching TV ideas to the networks. And there was a network called FYI, and they were going to launch their network with this show called Tiny House Nation. And I had never heard of tiny houses before. And they kind of told me about it. And I was like, that sounds fascinating. I went back to my office and I looked them up and saw all these wonderful houses on trailers with all these really cool design elements and this kind of movement, of people that were just like, look, housing's too expensive and this is how we're going to solve it. And I had done some construction work as a younger guy and kind of knew a little bit about it, but had a best friend here in Bend who is much more handy than me, my buddy Kit. And I called him and I said, hey, man, I'm going to sell all my stuff in LA and I want to move back to Bend and I want you to help me build a tiny house. And he said, all right, no problem. And so he had a big piece of property. It was about an acre and a huge shop with a wood stove in the back. And, he works as a building inspector, but he would in the mornings kind of help me be like, all right, we got to get the trailer. And so we found the trailer. And anyways, we built that first house, which was called the Hiatus. And it was on an 8 by 20 foot trailer. And it was really cool. It had a little dormer and it had a loft bedroom like most tiny houses on wheels do. And I was like, this is it, man. This is going to work in Bend because we had such a housing crisis and still do. And I just thought, no big deal. We'll put 4 of these on a lot and it's going to be great. Went to the city and the city was like, yeah, no way. That's not even possible. That's not attached to land. The density that we allow at residential standard zones is not that. And there's no way you can do that. So was in the Bend Design Conference with the tiny house and was overwhelmed with people that wanted to see this house. I mean, I had to do 2 talks because there were just people coming out of the doors and all over the house just wanting to see this thing. And that was the tiny house movement. People were just so into this kind of concept. And so that led to a phone call from an old boss of mine that's a real estate agent and developer here in town. And he said, yeah, I saw you in the paper and I saw this thing you're doing and I believe in it. And I think I've got a piece of property that you can do this on. Now, at the same time, the city of Bend had adopted what was called the Cottage Code in 2015. We now have another Cottage Code, but that was like the very first one. And it allowed you to do these small units. They had to be on foundations. But the trick to that one was they didn't have to face the street. It didn't matter what the lot size was, and it didn't matter what the house size was. So anyways, he calls me up, long story, but he calls me up and he's like, yeah, I got this 3 acres. That's great. And I'm like, 3 acres? Like, that's no way, man. I want to do like 4 houses, But he'd set the deal up so that we put basically 10,000 or I put $5,000 down that was a refundable escrow that was based on, because this would be the first use of the Cottage Code as well, was based on the land use approval with the city. So, I mean, I was shaking when I gave him the first $5,000. I didn't know what an escrow really was. I didn't really understand anything about land development. And I'm like, I'll get this back. And he's like, yeah, it's $5,000, man. Just like, it's totally fine. And so put the money in, but then I had the problem of how to finance it. It was going to be 20 plus lots, and it was a lot of money. And so heard about these guys, Trueline Capital, they're a private capital, building capital financiers in town. And I went to the kind of main guy and he's like, look, I can't finance this. I can't finance dirt, but I'm going to introduce you to 2 of the smartest guys I know, Jeff and Ryan, and buy them lunch and maybe they can help you out. And so that was when I met Ryan and came in and said, hey, man, I want to do 22 small homes in Bend. What do I do? And that's when we met. And I gave him a salad for it.
And Ryan's like, who is this crazy guy?
Well, it was funny. I mean, at the time, so Jesse comes in and we spent an hour working on a whiteboard trying to figure out how to pencil this thing out. Like, does it even work in a back of the napkin styled pro forma? And it didn't, was the short answer. We spent an hour figuring out that it did not work. And there were all kinds of hurdles. Low density was a hurdle. The cost of the horizontal construction was a hurdle. The impact fees, so what we call SDCs or system development charges, and building permits. All of that at the time was the same for a giant house as it was a tiny house. And so, the permit and SDC fees were amounting to like 30% of the build cost, whereas on a giant mansion, it would be, a 1% of the build cost. So there were all these economic hurdles to overcome. And, so we whiteboarded this thing out and we're like, man, I don't know that it's going to work. You got to solve some of these problems. And then, Jesse heads out that day, a little dejected. He comes back shortly after that, a couple weeks later, and he's like, okay, I solved a couple of these problems. We did this and that, and, let's see if it works now. And that went on for a while. My background was all on the finance side and creating funds, creating securities offerings, syndicating deals, especially real estate and development deals. And so, this project slowly over the course of a year moved ahead. And I had two moments that were really big aha moments for me in this new type of real estate asset. And, one was the investors. So, Jesse'd never raised capital in that way before. And we kind of slapped him on the back and we're like, go raise $1 million. And so he goes out and he goes and gets these investors in town, and they were just huge advocates for the project. They definitely wanted a return. And, spoiler alert, that project did exceptionally well economically. They did outstanding, but they definitely wanted a return, but they invested in that project because they believed in Jesse and they really believed in the product existing, these small homes. And there were a lot of naysayers that were like, nobody's going to want to buy a 600 square foot home. But the investors that came in really believed in the product. And, that was a big aha for me. And then the second big aha was, probably a year later, when, we're out on site, some of the homes are built, and the buyers in the homes, the response to the buyers or of the buyers was just incredible. And so, there's this guy that comes up to Jesse. We're at the site and he's like, are you Jesse Russell? And, sometimes when you're on your own construction site, you don't want to claim that you're the owner because people are just going to tell you about problems.
Yeah.
But this guy gives Jesse a huge hug and is like, thank you so much. I love my home. I moved here for this. And, a guy that you maybe wouldn't expect to give you a hug. And I just remember staying there being like, wow, people love these homes. Investors believes in these homes. It is the beginning of a movement and a new asset class in real estate. So we weren't like a couple of MBAs that were like, small housing is this demographic need in the world. We backed into it by just creating something in this kind of, if you build it, they will come. We built it, they came, and we were overwhelmed by the demand. And that was the beginning of, kind of the hiatus homes that we have today.
So
by the way, I just want to say, by the way, when he said you need to raise $1 million, that was a lot of money to me. My mom was a bartender. Oh, yeah. I don't have any money at that point at all. I've never done any kind of fundraising. And I was like, this is impossible.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, I think for most people, they would look at that and say, what? How am I going to do that? So I was going to ask you about in the interim between, when you did that first whiteboard and you're like, this just doesn't work. There's no way. And then when you came to a solution that did work, what changed that made the project workable in the end?
Yeah, it was a couple of key pieces. It was really working on costs were one, as you do with any developments. That's not necessarily unique. But then it was actually going out to some of the subcontractors, like the horizontal infrastructure group. So big challenge was there was this water canal, irrigation canal that flowed through the property. And that needed to be piped. And it needed to be piped in the winter when the water was not flowing through it, because once the water's flowing through it, you can't stop the water and pipe it. And so it was either we pipe this thing and do our horizontal development now, or we have to wait a whole year. And at the time, Jesse had not raised enough capital to to pay for that pipe and start that horizontal construction. But it was kind of like, all right, well, we got to move forward anyway and take a risk. And so, that was a key moment of the development, because the horizontal developers stepped up and said, we'll do it, and the cost of it we'll put in as equity on the project. You don't have to pay us. Just we'll take an ownership slice in the project, and we'll do it now.
And these guys, by the way, I was trying to find a horizontal contractor that would even bid the job, and none of the big guys in Bend would do it. Like, no one would call me back. And I get this call from Rod Robinson in Sisters, Oregon. Sisters, Oregon is 20 minutes from where I live. My mom worked at a bar in Sisters for 20 years called Bronco Billy's, and Rod Robinson happened to be one of the locals that would come in there on happy hour and have a beer. And he called and he's like, "Hey, Jess, I've heard about your project, and I think this thing sounds great, man. This is what we need." And he came out, and when it got to that point where it was like, we need to bury this pipe, I didn't have the money. I think it was 40 grand or something like that to do it. Rod said, "Hey, we'll do it, and I know you'll raise the money, and we'll get the pipe done so you can keep going." And he's an investor in our fund now, and he's done every one of our developments as our horizontal contractor.
That's fantastic. I mean, it's such a testament to relationships and finding creative ways to make things work. So again, this first one was, remind me, 20 homes you said? 22 homes. And so you sold these homes then? Or?
Yeah, they were just under 600 square feet. They're laid out a lot like a tiny house on wheels is. They have a lofted bedroom that is anywhere from 4 to 6 feet. It's a shed roof. And that lofted bedroom looks over the kitchen living room. There's another little loft on the other side that is a storage loft that a ladder goes up to, a bathroom, a little kitchen island, and that's basically what the houses were. They were all exactly the same. Some were mirrored, but they were the same finishes and the same design. And we would build, once we got the horizontal done, I got a construction loan. The very first two we had built in Salem as prefab houses with a company over there that was a tiny house builder. And it was so expensive to ship the house from Salem to Bend. Plus, the loft had to be much smaller because it had to come down the road, so there were height limits. Plus, the city had no clue how to inspect this thing because it was inspected in Salem, and then it was placed on a foundation, and we had these metal straps that connected the home, and it just didn't work, and the cost was enormous. And so after doing two of the homes like that, we went to site building, and that's when I became a GC as well as a land developer.
So I want to talk about that aspect just for a second, because one of the most common questions, especially people new to development, is why we don't see more manufactured, modular, especially for smaller homes and everything. And I wonder if you could just kind of talk a little bit more about that and what were a couple of the specifics. And have you learned something from that? Like, would you do it again now, having gone through both processes? Or
I have a lot to say about that. And the thing that I was doing that pretty early, and the company I was doing it with was not set up to be a prefab manufacturer. This was their kind of first foray into it. So I don't think it's a good example of what you can get today as far as prefab manufacturers go. Now, that said, I still think there's a lot of issues with prefabrication on large developments. For us in Oregon, it's the trucking. The truckers are not your employees, and they will basically kind of, decide when they're going to come and where they're going to come and how much it's going to cost you. We had to have cranes on both sides to pick the house up and put it down. The other part of it, it's an interesting pro forma question too, because a bunch of your costs are front loaded into building the building. It is better because you're building hopefully in a factory, and you're not dealing with concrete blankets and the things you have to do when you build outside in the winter here in Bend. But I think the way that thing works from a financial standpoint, the best prefab development would be one where you were manufacturing the prefab houses in a warehouse that was 2 blocks away from the land you were going to put them on. You owned the truck that was transporting it, and you got the profit from the building of the homes to the trucking to the setting them down on site. Now, there's a ton of work going into this right now, and I think it is certainly something that we'll see probably in the next 10 years or certainly in our lifetimes, especially in the small home, product where it'll work, but it's still a difficult thing to do. The shipping is hard. Like, what do?
Yeah.
You can't be over 13'9" in Oregon and travel down the house. You can then do blocks, right? You can do 2 stories easier than they can be 2 separate things. Now you've got 2 separate trucks and then you've got a crane. There's a lot to figure out there, but I still believe in it. I hope someone figures it out, and maybe it'll be us someday in the future. But right now we're stick built on site.
Yeah. Well, and not to mention, you still have all the site work that has to be done no matter what.
And you need the land.
Utility work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
So,
So when you see the Amazon house that has been delivered and there's cardboard on it that this guy like pulls apart and he's like, for $30,000 you got a house. I think we're a little bit further away from that than some people would like to say.
Well, and if I would connect the dots back to your TV world, there's a fun show that we've watched occasionally called Impossible Builds, which is a British show, but it's basically all about modular and manufactured.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, and they go to some just like ridiculous locations that are really hard to site build anyway. But
right, and it makes sense for a lot of places, right, where you can't. There's not a sub base to be able to build, so you do have to ship it. And there's great. I mean, we looked into prefab for an apartment building that we'd done, and there's a company that we talked with, and they're doing huge, ski resort style condos that are coming in these, cubes, and they set them down and they've made it work. So it works for certain things. It just, hasn't worked for us yet.
Yeah. So getting back to those 22 homes that you sold, was that like a condo arrangement then, or were they fee simple, or how did that work?
Yeah, fee simple. I mean, that's what was cool about this was that, there were all these kind of weird little pie slice lots, and they were all really different sizes, because unlike a traditional development where you just kind of take this big rectangle and put a street down the middle and then just chop it up into other rectangles. The cottage code allowed us to face the houses not to the street or the parking that was behind you. So when you approach a house in that development, you actually see the back door. And when you walk into the back door, it's circled around in a cluster. So there's 4 different clusters in that development. And inside a cluster is anywhere from 4 to 7 houses. And they all face into a common area. Some of those common areas have, gardens, there's fire pits, there's that sort of thing. But they were all on their own lot. There is an HOA, and that's a requirement of both of our cottage codes that there's an HOA involved. But yeah, you own the lot, and you pay. I forget. I own one of the houses still. I think our HOA fee is $100, or it might be $150 or something. It's real low. And
is the common area? Is the common area owned by the HOA?
It's maintained by the HOA. There's roads and there's even a big pond there that was there when we bought the property.
So, Ryan, I'm curious about, as you're working your way through this project and building it, selling it, what might have surprised you just from like the financial standpoint as you're just working through the economics of a deal like this?
Yeah, I mean, it was, as I kind of foreshadowed a minute ago, it was really economically successful and generated for the investors, which were a lot of, friends and family, early ambassadors, about a 25 to 29% IRR, depended a little bit when people got into the project, but did really well. In, a couple of years, some of the people almost doubled their money. So, I mean, the project did really well. And that was especially, that was when we launched the new business and what we call the fund today. And we can kind of go into that business model. But, so when it was time to return the capital and pay out the profits on that project, Jesse and I went over to one of the microbrews. We sat down. I had the spreadsheet up, so we calculated how much everybody was supposed to get paid, what their profit share was. He sat down, wrote all the checks. We took a selfie sitting at the table because we're like, I think this is the start of something big. I don't know what it's going to be. And we'd started to tell the investors, we're going to give you your money back. A few of them had just kind of teasingly been like, well, what's the next project? Do you guys have anything going on? And so before we sent him the check back, Jesse was like, what do we got to do? Like, we got to do something. Should we create a fund? And because he knew I'd run a couple of investment funds at that point, and I was like, yeah, maybe we should create a fund. And so we sat down, we wrote the check. So everybody got their check back, and with their check, we sent them a pitch deck for Hiatus Homes 2.0. What's the next iteration of the business? And if you want to invest in this, send us your check back. And so about 3/4 of the capital that we sent out the door came back within 2 weeks, and was the seed capital to the new fund. And the idea behind the new fund was, how can we do a series of these projects, not just one at a time like an individual syndication? So we ultimately put 4 projects into the fund that are here locally in Bend. They're all a little bit different, but we put 4 projects into the fund. And part of the business model behind that was, instead of going out to big private equity shops and trying to raise capital in New York and LA and Miami, from big professional investor groups that are going to control our life and suck all the profits out and send them out to investors we don't know, we were like, could we, we seeded this fund with local investors. Could we actually raise the fund from local investors that want to see these types of developments go on in their city? And then when the projects are hopefully successful and we send profits back, that benefits the community, because the people are getting their own profits, and they're also more likely to reinvest that back in the community into the next project, or into other community things. Then we also at the same time found that our investor and our customer in a lot of cases was the same person. So we had investors in our fund that had written us a check for capital then be like, hey, I want to buy one of your homes. What's the next one available? And then we had people that had bought our homes that were like, wait, what is this company, Hiatus Homes? Wait, you guys take investors? What is that? And then they wrote us a check to be part of the investment fund. So we really found this virtuous cycle where, when the community invested in the fund that created the projects, as the profits flow back into the community, they reinvest that in the business, they reinvest that in the community. And, today we were able to raise all the capital to do these projects, and, kind of keep them going in a laddered sense. They're all at different stages of development.
That's incredible.
And so do it with more than 3/4 of our investors are local. And
That's
so, that was a really fun part of this business model, was, raising it from people that care in the community. So
Yeah,
that was the origin of the fund.
I love this. I've not heard of anybody doing this approach before. It sounds fantastic, and a really cool example for people who are going to work just in like their own community. Can you give a sense of the scale? Like, what are the size of the projects that you are raising money for? The 22 homes, was that like what, $10 million that project, or $5 million? And the other ones that you have going, like how big are those projects?
Yeah, so the fund that we're running now that has 4 projects has about 130 units in it. Now, one of those projects is a 59-unit apartment building.
Okay.
And so that's, half of the total units almost, in just that project alone. That project is not a typical apartment building, in that what we've tried to basically do was take a whole cottage community, but stack it into a single building. And so we've got common kitchens, common community spaces, co-working type spaces on each floor. And then everybody has their own unit. And the units are very similar to our actual small home or cottage development design, in that you've got it's like an open lofted 1-bedroom unit with a little kitchenette downstairs, your own bathroom, and a great room living space with 13-foot ceilings, great views as you look out your big storefront windows. And so that's one project. We've got a 45-unit development that we're in the planning stages on now. That will be all cottages, some combination of our 500, 600, 800 square foot cottages. And then we've got some other projects that are one we're breaking ground on January 3rd, that is twin homes. And so that's basically our take on a duplex. Mm-hmm. So the whole building is 1,200 square feet, but you actually get 2 units in that. And so you get a 1-bedroom, 1.5 bath with a garage. And then above the garage, you have an attached kind of studio style lofted apartment. And so you could live in one unit and rent the other out. You could have a multi-generational type household situation where you have, an aging parent, an age in place parent in one, and an adult child living in the other side, or vice versa. A college kid that can't buy their own piece of real estate, come home and live in one of the sides. So it's a really cool, flexible way to do a duplex in our view, and attached product. So we have these different projects. The whole thing put together, the whole fund is probably about $100 million in total real estate finished value. And so that's around the scale that we're working on right now.
So $100 million for all the projects together, roughly costs all in, which means you're not raising $100 million.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's $100 million of finished real estate value. So, our actual fund is about 7 million.
Yeah.
So, you talk about like the incredible efficiency of capital when you are doing projects at different stages. And instead of giving the investors capital back when one project finishes, we're able to just reallocate that to the entitlements or horizontal construction on the next project.
Right.
We primarily use the capital in the fund, the equity in the fund for acquisition and entitlement work. And then we use debt for the construction on it.
Yeah, I think
so that's able to leverage as well.
I think it's really important for people to understand that it's like you're not raising $100 million. You've raised 7. You're in that ballpark, and that amount of money, I think a lot of first-time developer people, that seems like a lot of money. But once you've executed a project or two, you're probably in the ballpark of being able to raise that kind of money for any effort, and so doing what you've done then allows you to have the leverage to do multiple projects at once and really have an impact in your community. That's pretty cool. So then on the investor side, the investors are they looking to get like periodic payouts? Are they long-term owners of like income producing real estate? How do they see a benefit other than obviously they're interested in supporting what goes on in Bend?
Right. They feel good about it. But you got to do more than that when we're talking investors. Yeah. I mean, it's not a nonprofit. It's an investment with real returns. So the way we structured it is the investors get profit distributions when each project liquidates or when a major phase of a project liquidates. So because these projects are not creating liquidity along the way, if we were paying investors quarterly, we'd just be giving them a tiny piece of their money back. But we didn't generate any revenue yet because it takes 3 years to generate revenue maybe on a project. So, we told them this is a long-term investment. This is, roughly a 7-year investment. We're 4 years into that, so we've got a couple years left. And it took us a long time to work through the projects, but basically we told our investors, as each project wraps up, we're going to sit down, calculate the profits for that overall project. It's not per home. It's for a whole development or, phase 1 of a major development. We'll send out distributions then. And then at the end of the project, you get your original capital back. So we're trying to keep everybody's capital so we can be really efficient with that 7 million, roll it from project to project, put debt on top of it for the construction, and then give it back at the end.
That's terrific. And then you all essentially are working like as a project manager or development partner in the deal. And how are you getting paid?
Yeah, so what we call our management company, it's basically like the little operating company that does the work. We have 4 employees, me and Jesse, and 2 great executive level team members. So we basically get some management fees from the fund, but when we set it up, we set almost all the compensation up to be milestone based and profit based. And so it's a little different. A lot of times when people syndicate these deals, they put a whole bunch of fees along the way. This fee, that fee, financing fee, liquidation fee, acquisition fee, disposition fee, asset management fee, liquidation fee, all along the way. And then when you get to the end, Then you do an 80-20 split with your investors, and you go out and tell your investors, I'm giving you 80% of the profits, but you've actually feed the thing so much along the way that, like, the developers, they've taken a lot of risk off the table, but they've picked up their profits along the way. We wanted to make ours simple. We knew we were not creating a deal for professional private equity fund style investors. We wanted a deal that had a very simple fee structure so we could sell it to retail investors in the community. So we said, hey, we're going to take a management fee. We take a small fee when we create the lots, but that barely keeps the lights on. And then we backloaded everything to basically liquidation and profit share. But then we're splitting with our investors somewhere between about 45 and 55% of the profits. So roughly half and half. And so we basically told our investors, hey, we're in these with you half and half. We backloaded all our comp. So we're incentivized to do the right thing. When you make money, when we do a distribution to you, we make money and get a distribution ourselves. And that worked really well for that model. Some investors don't understand that because they see a 50-50 profit split and they're like, that's crazy. I'm used to 80-20. But for the most part, we were able to talk people through this very flat fee structure and talk about the alignment, and they appreciated that. Another piece is we did not put a pref on this. So a pref, or a preferred return, is a very common economic term that gets put on these deals. And so a preferred return is like, might be 7%. And that accrues, even if it's not paid, that accrues month over month, year over year. And the investors get their 7% accruing or compounding return before there's any profit split. That's a really common way to do these. Investors like that because they're like, well, I want to make sure I make at least 7 before I split anything with my manager. So they're incentivized. Mm-hmm. We have no pref on our fund. And the reason we don't, and I was opinionated about this and had to defend it with almost every investor, was I said, what you're doing is you're actually misaligning our incentives.
Right.
This was back in 2020 when the real estate market was about to explode because of COVID and everything. And I said, you're misaligning our incentives because over the next 7 years, there's no way we're going to get through without some kind of downturn in real estate. And the smartest thing for us to do as investment managers might be to pause the fund for a year, pause construction for a year. If I have a pref ticking up behind me, I know, well, I can't pause for a year and a half, even if that's the best thing to do for all of our investors, because then the investors are going to suck up all the profits in a pref and I'm not going to make any money. So let's just move forward and liquidate now at a lower price or at a loss because, the opportunity cost to me as an investment manager is too high. So I said, you don't want to disincentivize me to do the right thing and to pause on a development if we hit a downturn. And then, Jesse and I looked at each other 100 times over the last 2 years because we did have to slow construction on one of our projects, and we did slow the paperwork on another project. And then, another one that we got building permits for, we had to hit the pause button on for a number of months. So what we did is we went back to our investors and we said, hey, remember how we told you our risk mitigation plan was to pause. We don't want to lose money. We just want to pause. And so we're pausing now while we see what happens with interest rates. What does the Fed do? How's the market impacted by this like inflationary and then interest rate cycle? And our investors were receptive to that. We had no redemptions. Everybody got it. Everybody stayed in. And I think everybody understood, oh, this is why you didn't put a pref on it, because otherwise, that pref ticking up for that year and a half would, create a misalignment.
Yeah. Interesting. Jesse, I want to also talk, there's another aspect of your business that I noticed that was about actually doing ADUs for people who have an existing home and they like one on their property. How did you get into that world, and talk a little bit about like what that has meant to you all, or what you're doing with it?
Yeah, sure. So as Ryan's talking about, we created the fund to, I've lived in Bend and have been from here for a long time, and this is a boom and bust town. It's happened multiple times where the property values are shooting up and everyone's like, man, Bend is never ever gonna change. We're just gonna make all this money off of real estate. And then something happens and there's a problem. If you're a developer that doesn't own your land and doesn't own your entitlements during that time and you can't sell it, that can ruin a person and it can ruin a good investment that will come back around in time. And so that was one of the things we did with the fund, was to be able to own our land and own our as Ryan described, so we could pause. Well, when that happened, when we slowed down a bit, we looked around and said, hey, what else can we start doing right now that's going to help keep us all going, and then also help with the models that we're putting in the fund. So we started looking into what we call Hiatus at Home, which it started out as mostly an ADU program where you have a piece of property, you have equity in your property, and you have some space to build an ADU. We have anywhere from 5 to 7 designs that we can put back there. So we started this program. What was really interesting is the first 2 projects that we got were not one ADU; they were two of our units, in a residential lot. So those are finishing up now, those original ones. And what we realized pretty quickly for us was that it was actually better for us to do multiple units on people's property. There were enough kind of small developers, or I don't know what you want to call them, kind of like some people that we would see at Jim's convention, is like some of those people are just starting out. They're like, hey, I've got some property, I want to try something. So we've now seen that program become less about single ADUs and more about these kind of mini cottage developments where you can put 2 or 3 or 4 homes in someone's backyard. And so we've started doing that, and it's been really great because we now have built some new models that we've gotten to build and then iterate on and make better. That's led us to do a lot of feasibility studies for people too. That's anywhere from someone that's got a little 10,000 square foot lot that says, hey, I love what you guys are doing. I own the land outright and I want to see what it would look like to have 4 of your cottages here. We'll charge an hourly rate, and we take that piece of property and our team gets into it and we place the units on there and we do some code research and we make sure that's going to work. And then we do a pro forma for them. Ryan does a pro forma based on, we know how much it costs to build our homes. We do market research for that area to decide how much we think they can rent or sell for. And then we're able to give that client an idea of like, hey, if you go forward with this project, this is what it's going to look like. And that's been great to do because, everybody needs to do feasibility on their properties. I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of pieces of property we have looked at. And we have about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 that we've done over the last 7 years or something. There's so many things that have to be looked at before you make a decision. I think it's fine to get, as I did with that escrow, get a piece of property into escrow, but you need to make sure it's going to work in the city. You need to make sure that you know how much this thing's going to cost. So yeah, that Hiatus at Home thing that was an ADU program has morphed a little bit. We still do ADUs for people. We have one we're doing, but that has become more like our hedgehog has become these cottage communities, helping other people to see if they want to do a cottage community, what the feasibility looks like to do a piece of property, and then doing our own developments.
So, God, there's just like so many things I could ask here about all that. I'm fascinated by all that, but start with what's the regulatory environment like? What's the zoning issues like, especially because there's obviously a lot of places where it's very, very difficult to do ADUs or cottages. A lot of places have started to liberalize this and make it easier. What's it been like in Bend?
Yeah. I joke about this. If I wouldn't have been from Bend and I would have been going to my hometown and it wasn't Bend, Oregon, I don't know if I'd be sitting here talking to you, because Bend has been so progressive in their fight to have housing for the people who live here. And that's, become what's called workforce housing or middle income housing. That wasn't even a term when we started trying to do this tiny house movement, but it was really for our community. We looked at it and it's like, well, shit, a nurse can't afford a house anymore. Mm-hmm. As I referenced my mom, previously, she was a bartender and we had a house over on the west side. That house was about $90,000. That house is now worth probably $750 to $1 million. So, the regulatory thing is one of the biggest things. And when we look at another place, now Oregon, Washington, Idaho is kind of where we're looking at. We have to see like what's their code allow for. We had, as Ryan was describing, when we did that first development, the cottage code was the only code that was really revolutionary there and did not give us a density bonus. And the SDCs, which is the system development charges, which is what you pay every time you build a house here in Bend, was $30,000. Well, I was like, well, shit, by the time, probably in a few months, they're going to scale that. I mean, that doesn't make sense for this 500 square foot house to be paying a 10,000 square foot house and the same. Those SDCs just got scaled like a year ago. So, I mean, we're talking that took like 5 years to do. Now, the state of Oregon is also really on this issue. And they had a House Bill 2001, which said, hey, here's the deal. In all of these residential standard zones, if your city is 20,000 people or above, you have to allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and cottages. And so that's a requirement for every city in Oregon that's above 20,000 people. We, as Bend, we decided, I was on the stakeholder group. We all, stakeholders from all over Bend, those are developers, those are people from the city, those are builders, those are, people who care about this type of housing. We said, we want to go further. We don't want to just do duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. What about micro apartments? And micro apartments are the apartment building that we're doing. What about small unit developments where like, hey, the lot doesn't need to be 4,000 square foot as a minimum for these houses. We can do them at 2,500, and so we went really far into, we have in our code 3.8 development alternatives, which is, I forget, 6 or 7 different types of housing, alternate housing and building types that are meant really to densify the city and the city limits that we have here in Bend. So we have more housing types. And, sorry, I can keep rambling about this, but I'll say one more thing about this. This was a big thing that when, I went to Ryan and said, hey, let's start this business, that was, I think, really interesting to both of us and remains to be crazy. And that's that most houses are not made of a wife, a husband, and 2 kids anymore. It's mostly a single person. And so the house, these 3-bedroom, 2 baths that are everywhere that all these big builders were building, it just didn't make sense. So, we had a real tailwind with the city of Bend and the people who live in Bend who care about a lift op and a nurse and a bartender being able to own a home.
Right.
So we've been lucky, but that started to spread, and we're seeing it, all over the country where cities are saying, whoa, we have a problem here when people can't afford a home early in their financial lives.
Yeah. Have you had many copycat developer builders locally that look at what you've done and say, we think we can do that too?
Yeah, we had one that I won't mention, but won't mention by name. He's a really great guy. He came and looked at our homes, and then he built 2 homes that looked really, really similar. He did his own take, and it's totally fine. And I take that as a compliment. And I also always say this too, that I hope that everywhere across the U.S., when people are looking around at different houses, they're like, that's a condo, that's an apartment, that's a townhouse, that's a cottage, that's a small house. It just becomes a housing type. And the need for this is so huge that I don't think, maybe I'm being naive, but I think there's plenty of work out there for people who want to do these types of houses in their community. And if everybody starts building that and we don't have a company anymore, but there's housing for everybody, that'd be pretty cool, I think,
Yeah, I agree.
I wouldn't have a plane or a jet, but I would have peace of mind when I go to sleep.
I mean, I think about it a little bit like, maybe self-storage was 25 years ago. Like that was a new emerging asset class. And, a lot of people got in on it. And, there wasn't one single developer that developed self-storage. And it wasn't like, what if somebody else developed self-storage? It's like, no. Self-storage became a new category of asset class. I think cottages are emerging into being a new category of asset class. And it's kind of limited only by the regulatory environment. And then I think, investors being willing to put up the capital into this new asset class. the buyers are there. In a nod to what, Jesse was talking about, the change in demographics. When I said earlier, we weren't like a couple MBAs that, cooked up this plan and then executed on a business. What we fell backwards into was scratching our heads and being like, man, we built 22 cottages and we could have sold 100. Why? Why did so many people want this? And that was when we went backwards and figured out, more than 50% of US households are just an individual or a couple, and they would rather buy, or at least a big chunk of them would rather buy an attainable by design or missing middle styled home. And that is a home that is just naturally at a lower price point because it's not a 3,200 square foot home in the suburbs. It's a smaller home with higher density that's just going to cost less by its design.
Well, and you've got that community aspect that is unique with the court arrangement, so which is just not common at all.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. And people
There's a big attractor.
Yeah, and people self-select into those, those communities. They want to have, they want to know their neighbors, and they want to see them when they're walking around, and it makes them feel, I think, more comfortable and enjoy their, where they live more.
Yeah, and so that brings me to the last thing I'll ask you today, which, I've had a lot of conversations with people recently who are really into the cottage court idea. I designed a few back in the day, and almost all the ones that we talk about are these kind of smaller, one bedroom, often one bedroom plus cottages, and there's also a discussion to be had about a similar type of courtyard arrangement, but with bigger homes that are for families and, people with small children, and sort of the shared, courtyard arrangement and the benefits of that if you've got little kids. Is that something you've explored or thought about at all? Do you see a need for that in the marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my best friends from here works for Gale Architects, and they're out of Copenhagen. He works in their San Francisco office, and I mean, I've just always wanted to go to Copenhagen, right? I'm like, oh, this is just like a person that does this type of stuff. That's like Disneyland for them. And I got to go there and to see like what they have for what you're talking about, these courtyard apartments that are only 3 stories high, and they have this beautiful courtyard where all the kids can play and the families can hang out. And there's a really good separation between their little front porch that's semi-private and then their units that they live in. A lot of these are 2 or 3 bedrooms, and they're not huge, but I think there's absolutely I think for Bend and us doing these kind of small units that are their own 4 walls that have their own property for the size that Bend is, these make a lot of sense. Now, when we were in Kansas City cruising around, I'm like, man, it'd be great to do a cottage development here in Kansas City. And then I'm like, well, no, it's not at all. Because there's this huge brick building that's 50,000 square feet that it already exists that you can come into, not easily, not to take anything away from people that are doing that work, because it is very difficult like anything. But cottages wouldn't make sense in that kind of urban environment. So, we just found our little thing that we're doing right now, and we're trying to fill that gap right there. And would we ever build a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house or a courtyard? We do have a cottage or a court. I forget what that building is called in our code, but we have the ability to do that in Bend, and we've looked at that. But again, we're like 4 people. We've got some projects, but we want to do everything. But we decided that it's probably best that we try to concentrate on one thing and do it well.
Yeah. Well, this has been really, really fascinating, guys. I appreciate the time. It's a really unique and interesting model that I think a lot of people could learn from. What is the best way for people to find you if they want to talk to you, reach out to you, or see what you're doing?
Yeah, it's just Jesse at hiatushomes.com or Ryan at hiatushomes.com. Go to hiatushomes.com and you can see our website that has all our projects on it. It includes the Hiatus at Home stuff. If there's, if there's people out there that have a property and they're interested in getting some help with how to do some cottages or a couple houses on that property, we love to talk to people on the phone about this. We love to help people that are, I didn't have a dad that was a real estate developer or have any experience in this at all. So I know what it's like to start that journey, and it really is, you will be surprised at the people who come out of the woodwork to help you. I mean, it just go forward and take that step, and you'll have these times where you're like, I don't know what a perform is. I used to call it a pro form. I didn't know what the hell it was. I know what a perform is now very, very well. But that's because of Ryan, because I met Ryan, and that first piece of property, even the land, which was really pretty inexpensive at the time, those were literally friends and family. And I would at the end of the week, I would think of 5 people that I could call, and I had a little pitch deck that I'd made up on PowerPoint or whatever. I'd call them up and I'd say, "This is what I'm trying to do," and you're going to put 10 grand in, and you're going to get 12 grand back. And they got that money back, And then when we had to raise more money, it was the same thing. It was like, I'm just going to sit and think about people and talk to them about this thing. And if you're passionate about it and you love it, it comes through and people get into it and they'll help you, So land development and doing this kind of work, I don't feel like I work. Ryan and I talk about this all the time. We come to work and we work hard. We have a great time doing it. But it's given us a lot of freedom. It gives us a lot of creativity. It makes us participate with the city. I didn't understand city politics or city anything. And now I go down there and I love being on committees and trying to help. And it's such a great way to participate with your community trying to do one of these developments.
That's really well said. And I think a great place to stop. So Jesse and Ryan, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time. Good luck with everything. And I hope we talk again.
Absolutely, Kevin. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, man. We'll see you soon.
All right. Take care.